Honda's classic period for motorcycle production culminated in one of the craziest motorcycles to ever be released to the public, the Honda CBX 1000. Now, you've probably seen, or rather heard of this bike. But this wasn't always an iconic motorcycle, more of a business and even engineering failure, some would say, from Honda Motor Company. The CBX was meant to be a flagship bike, but it sold a mere 25,000 units in its 4-year run from 79 through 82. And if you know anything about Honda from this era and this time, and even up until today, it's that they sell motorcycles, more motorcycles than anybody else. And 25,000 units in 4 years might be okay for, Ducati, but it's not okay for Honda. Though this bike is known by the general motorcycle community primarily for its sound, the Honda CBX was so much more than a motorcycle belting out an unholy Formula One sound. This bike was actually the first production motorcycle in its standard form available to the general public that exceeded 100 brake horsepower. And the CBX was, in many ways, the logical sort of final step for Honda during the classic period for them. More cylinders, bigger displacement, more cams, more engine in this case, as one writer puts it from the time, acres of engine. But if this bike was such a statement piece and considered so iconic and collectible today, then why did it fail? First, though, a bit of history regarding Honda. Honda's motorcycles in the late 60s and early 70s were engineering marvels. Revolutionary platforms outperforming virtually all of the competition. Think motorcycles like the CB750, of course, but also the 500 and 550 and CB350, the double overhead cam CB450. Basically the best of the best. A lot of these bikes were light years ahead of most of the competition. Honda of the late 70s was a different story, however. Bikes like the CB750 and 550 were better versions of their original self, for sure, but largely unchanged in the last decade since their inception. Honda was still making some of the best and certainly the most popular motorcycles in the world, but they weren't really innovating the way that they had 10 years prior. Other Japanese companies like Kawasaki were making faster, more audacious motorcycles for the general public. Honda was becoming, dare I say, conservative, and nobody likes a conservative motorcycle manufacturer. Not to name names, but Honda itself as a company was sort of in a transition period at this time in terms of designers and engineers. Traditionally, at this point, the older, more experienced minds were creating the bikes for production and sales, whereas the younger engineers and designers were building the race bikes. But with the CBX, room was made for these bright, young, sort of wild minds to build something audacious, and the Honda 6 was exactly that. So this was obviously a 6-cylinder motorcycle, a step up from the 4-cylinder that they had been making. They chose to go with a double overhead cam and 24 valve setup, essentially 4 valves per cylinder instead of 2, in part for weight savings, and also in part because having the label 24 valves was just ridiculous and cool. The engine itself was tipped forward 33 degrees to make room for, a rider. And the 6 carburetors are mounted to the engine at a V to sort of fit within the frame. And there was an interesting component called a jack shaft that was added. Basically, they needed to keep the width of the engine down. I mean, it's already wide enough, but it could have been a lot wider because basically this jack shaft runs the alternator and the ignition timing and more. And this made room instead of tucking those items on the end of the crankshaft. Miraculously, this engine is only a smidge wider than the CB750s. I've gotten different reports on how much wider. One person said 2 inches from the time, which I think is actually correct, but somebody else said just less than an inch. So I don't know. It really wasn't that much wider than the 4 cylinders that they were already making. But because you see the pipes and you see the 6 cylinders, it looks so much wider. And this jack shaft really did help to keep it down. This was one of the project leader Soichiro Iramajiri's favorite innovation for the CBX. This motorcycle really marked a return to innovation and a focus on just raw performance for Honda. This was sort of a crown jewel for the company, and Cycle World at the time notes the incredible hush surrounding this bike as journalists were allowed to test the bike prior to its release. So the bike came out in 79, but in 78 they were all getting to look at it. It should have been presented to the higher-ups first. This is sort of what Cycle World notes, instead of being potentially leaked by the Americans, but after its sort of production and creation. It was given to the Americans for basically test rides and for journalists to get a pre-look at it. But when the bike was not being ridden by testers, it was either being filmed by Honda Motor Company or it was hidden under covers away at the racetrack. Now, there's quite a bit more to note about this bike's development. This really was Honda's racing technology adapted for the street, but quite a lot was missing. Namely, it still utilized a tubular frame and conventional front and rear suspension. In reality, these areas probably should have been rethought for a bike of this magnitude. But to understand why the CBX failed, I've decided to go right to the sources. In this case, my favorite kind of source, articles and road tests from the time of the original bike. Sure, you or I could ride a CBX 1000, and yeah, I could compare it to the few other old motorcycles I've ridden, but these journalists at this time, they were riding everything, the same way that journalists are today. So if anybody's going to understand this motorcycle, it's those guys. They note the innovative aspects of a 6-cylinder configuration. For example, the fact that a 6 can actually utilize lighter, smaller mufflers than a 4, as 6 smaller explosions are quieter than 4 larger ones. So this actually means that there's more clearance for the mufflers when leaning the bike over. You don't have to muffle as much as when you have 4 larger explosions. And reviewers praise the engine's smoothness and power on track. There's stories of this bike running in dealerships and they could put a quarter on the gas tank and it wouldn't move because it was just so smooth while it was idling. This was the smoothest bike ever made at this point. The braking was phenomenal, if not geared a little bit more towards experienced riders. Some reviewers at the time said the braking wasn't adequate, but Cycle World actually says that it was bitey and almost more aggressive than most people would even be able to handle. But the suspension and the swing arm really were not up to par with the bike's power. But when I say that this bike was too much motorcycle for its own good, it's not that the motorcycle couldn't handle itself, as many have made it sound. People make claims that the bike's frame couldn't handle how powerful the engine was, or that it couldn't handle the weight of the bike, or that the bike felt like it was just going to explode, or that it was incredibly unreliable. And that just isn't true. This bike failed for a different reason. It actually has proven itself to be incredibly reliable. The brakes were really fantastic for this time. It's something else. It's that this bike was actually almost too committed to performance. The design is a great example of this. It's meant to convey what the bike really is. It's not designed specifically to look appealing. They wanted to convey that this is an absolute beast of a motorcycle. Monsters aren't pretty, and they should be taken on with a healthy amount of fear. The instrument panel was originally prettier, but the engineers decided to nix it because they wanted function to be everything, and that had to be conveyed at every point for the motorcycle. So the bike's performance wasn't pretty, so why make the gauges and all the lights pretty? Now, from our perspective, we may see a cockpit like what's on the CBX and just think, oh, it's meant to be simple, or that's just old looking. But there's so much more going on when you actually dig in. For example, the gauges have black backgrounds, glare-free glass, and white-tipped needles, all of these so that you could have better visibility at high speeds. A lot of this was technology taken straight from military and fighter jets. And the sound of the motorcycle, which is now so incredible and iconic at this point, is so much more than just the sound of any given 6-cylinder engine. I mean, the Goldwing has a 6-cylinder engine. It doesn't sound anything like this. The designers were making the motorcycle equivalent of a fighter jet. This thing is a fighter jet on 2 wheels, and so they wanted it to sound like a fighter jet. And the exhaust was actually designed and built to match the sound of a fighter jet, so the designers actually spent time at the Hyokuri Japanese Air Force Base listening to fighter jets and laboring to capture that sound for this bike. Now, if you think this bike sounds like an airstrike happening around you, which it does, know this. They actually scrapped those phantom exhausts, as people call them, for something a bit more civilized. In other words, the version that we know and are hearing is actually the tame version, and we'll never know what the bike was originally meant to sound like. Because apparently they took the bike and they took its exhaust and they presented it to the people leading the project, and they said, listen, we can't make a motorcycle that sounds like this. It was that crazy. But if so much was right and innovative about this bike, I mean, we haven't even talked about the carburetors. This is the most advanced carburetor setup to ever be attached to a street-going motorcycle at this time anyways, like up until this point. But anyways, the question still stands, why didn't the CBX work the way the CB750 did when it was released? Now, many point to its shortcomings, like we've mentioned, the frame, the suspension primarily, I really think that's missing the point, and I think that's a bit off. Honda's other more successful motorcycles had shortcomings as well. The CB750 didn't handle near as well as many of its other competitors, but people still bought it, and they bought it like crazy. Now, you'd assume that this wide engine would cause the bike to have less cornering clearance than the competitors, but Cycle World notes that it actually had better clearance than any other big bike that they had tested in the 5 years leading up to this, better than any Ducati or Suzuki or Kawasaki or Yamaha. The thing leaned over and turned just fine. Some testers actually found it hard to get the bike to wobble or wallow in high speed. I mean, there are reviewers, again, saying that the suspension is antiquated and terrible, and obviously it wasn't quite up to par, but the average rider out on the street was never going to be able to get this thing to feel like the suspension was a real problem. And when I actually undertook learning more about the CBX, I was assuming that this bike was too much for its own good, meaning that it was too much for itself, too much power for the frame or brakes, too much performance for its own capabilities. But that's not true. Experienced testers again found the brakes to be incredible. This wasn't a powerful bike with brakes that couldn't stop it. These were the most performance-oriented brakes to ever hit a Honda motorcycle. And therein actually lies one example of the problem. It's not that the bike was too much for its own good in that way. I think that it was too much for the riders. People were afraid of this bike. It really was a motorcycle for experienced riders with 100 horsepower and 600 pounds wet. I mean, it was an absolute handful, and you could tell looking at it or sitting on it at a dealership that it was probably too much for you. The Ninja H2 of its time, you could say. Maybe not the best handling, maybe a bit heavy, but unbelievably powerful and incredibly fast in a straight line. Pure, just raw acceleration like nothing that had ever been built before it. And the bike exudes that personality and that aura of being an experienced rider's bike. You know, excessive is the word that comes to mind. Size, design, power, weight, the whole bike was excessive in every way. And the CB750 was not that way. That was the bike for riders, a do-it-all machine. Yeah, sure, it outperformed and was faster than pretty much everything else that was available, but it was a do-it-all machine. It was a tourer if you wanted it to be. It could be fast if you wanted it to be. It was highly customizable. It was incredibly reliable, very simple, and it was beautiful. It looked like a proper motorcycle, but this thing just appeared to be a monster with that gigantic 6-cylinder engine right there at the forefront. The CB750 was one of the most powerful, fastest motorcycles of its day, but it really was a rider's bike. Those 4 cylinders were audacious in their day, but not the way the CBX's 6 cylinders were in its day. The 750 was great and popular, not primarily because it was so ridiculously fast or powerful, but because it was just good in every way, from the brakes to the suspension, to the performance, to the reliability, to all the different features that came with the bike. The CBX was not like the CB750 in its day. It wasn't better at really anything other than going incredibly fast in a straight line. Sure, it had virtually no vibration and was incredibly smooth, but you know, Honda's 750 at this point and GL1000 and other bikes that were available, other Japanese bikes, were already incredibly smooth. It just wasn't really offering anything better for the average rider, and it intimidated people. The CBX failed because it was a weapon, because it really was a fighter jet on 2 wheels in every way, and in 1978, I think the average rider was very intimidated by it. Now, this was really the point where innovation in engineering and performance among motorcycle manufacturers started to surpass the skills of virtually all riders, and because of that, it also started the trend of really the highest performing bikes within a lineup no longer being the best-selling bikes. Sure, a Panigale V4 and Yamaha R1, sure they sell, but they don't sell the way that the CB750 sold. But it's the high margins that make those bikes really profitable, not the volume. The average street rider really doesn't need any more than what a CB750 offered. 65-ish horsepower is enough for virtually anything you can do on a legal road. And bikes that were faster and started to get faster and more powerful than the CB750, for the most part, didn't perform quite as well as it did. There's a great quote from Dale Bowler regarding the CBX that really explains and actually predicts why the CBX wouldn't sell. Here's what he says. He says, "I feel their 6-cylinder, 24-valve approach reflects fanaticism to prove a point without regard to practicality. What is the CBX good for? The BMW and XS11 tour better, the Z1R looks flashier, the GS1000 handles better and is far more versatile. Some people will buy the CBX because that's how they see themselves as motorcyclists, and want to be seen as motorcyclists. Some buyers will have swooned at the technology, but none of this relates to traveling down the road in a practical manner. Admittedly, motorcycles are not practical vehicles to begin with, but most motorcycles reflect a good deal of practicality within their impractical definition. At what was Honda aiming when it unleashed the seething six? Was it prestige and publicity intended to help sell hawks? Perhaps it was to make the achievements of competing factories seem less impressive. To understand the CBX, we must return to the primal motivation of hardcore motorcycle enthusiasts, the only ones who will be buying the CBXs, and he's spot on. And also note, he's predicting this. The public won't be graduating from moped to CBX, nor will teenagers be riding them to school. However, people who live, eat, drink, sleep, and worship motorcycles will lay helpless in the wake of CBX performance. Probably the most intense of all the sensations that attract the enthusiast to motorcycles is acceleration. Raw, wind in the face, engine screaming acceleration. There can never be too much, and it can never be experienced too often. Nothing will bring an instant reputation to a motorcycle and a motorcycle company faster than great heaps of raw, unmuzzled performance. Its appeal is so intense, an enthusiast will overlook an abyss of impracticality to get it. When I experience the CBX, I feel power, satisfaction, fright, and a dozen other emotions, not from its handling or braking or looks or even from its technology, but from its throttle. For this reason alone, I will probably buy one. So perhaps it is me and not Honda that is afflicted with fanaticism. I feel like this is such a perfect description of the bike. It offers absolutely raw, unmuzzled performance. That's really not what the CB750 was, and for that reason, people didn't buy it, because that's not what most riders want. Now, the last thing I wanted to do for this video was reach out to someone who owned a CBX and get their perspective, and there's this great channel on YouTube called Villions Garage. He owns a CBX and rides it and talks about it. So if you guys want to learn more about this, or just go show his channel some love, go give him a subscription. I'll put a link down below and you guys can check him out. He actually goes through in a couple different videos getting the bike, cleaning it up, getting it running, and it's really cool. It's really fun. So I think you guys should definitely check it out. Anyways, I wanted to ask him some questions about this bike and get his perspective. So let's check that out.
Let me start off by saying, who wants a base model in anything? And the CBX was the flagship for Honda at that time. So it was the pinnacle of what they can offer. It's always nice to have something like that. So yeah, that's the first thing. And combined with that, the look of the bike. If you think about riding a motorcycle, if you break it down to the bare minimum, you want to ride an engine. That's what you want to do. Unfortunately, you can't sit on it, so you need a seat. You need some kind of a container to keep the fuel, and you need somewhere to hang on to. And if you take like the front corner look of a CBX, if you look at that picture, say from a 10 o'clock angle, you see that big wide engine with the 6 pipes coming out of it. It's got a seat, it's got a fuel tank, and some place to hang on to. Just that bare, almost simplistic, nothing's been hidden look. I love that. It's how a bike should look, especially a classic bike. The British bikes also looks like that. It just got that bare openness on it, in it. So the sound obviously is incredible. I love how the bike sounds. Some people say it sounds like an old Formula One car. It really does. It sounds phenomenal. So I love I just love the sound. And then lastly, it's because it's so rare. You can't find them anymore, especially the early C or Z, as you call them, Z and A models. You can't find them. It's nice to have something that was the best and is rare now. And it looks good, and it rides the way you like. So that's why I always loved them, and I don't think I'll ever sell this one. I got my hands on it at last, so I wanna keep it. So yeah, that's why I like it. In one word, heavy. I mean, you can't get away from the fact that it weighs 600 pounds ready to go. So you definitely feel the weight. As soon as you start moving, it's manageable, but when you stop, don't let it tip over on you because it will drag you down. Just a little fact that I can bore you with. It looks pretty wide, but did you know that there's only 1 inch on each side that it's wider than a CB750? It's not that it's not unmanageable. It looks very impressive and it looks very wide, but it's very torquey from low down. I mean, I think about 2,000 RPM, 2,500 RPM. It pulls really strong. So it's got that nice meaty, torquey feeling to it. The acceleration is brisk. It did the quarter mile under 12 seconds back then. So it's a quick bike, but I don't ride it for the speed. I ride it for the whole event, how it sounds and how it goes. Smooth, if the 6 carburetors are tuned properly and synced. It's a nice quick revving engine. I mean, it's like bum, 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 bum. It's quick. It's got a quick response to it, and it's smooth. It's smooth as hell. So I love it. The best thing about it, I would say, is if I glance down on the fuel tank, it says CBX double overhead cam 24 valves, and you see this big motor sticking out on the side. I mean, it just looks and feels so mean. Think Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator 2. You get that mean feeling, and it's a joy to ride. So what's it like to ride? You'll smile when you ride one. I think there were 2 big concerns or 2 big issues that period. In the late 70s, a big recession was looming, which affected the world's economy. So just when they launched the bike, buyers were being scared off in buying anything basically then. And they sold the bike for, like, I think it was around $4,200 if I remember correctly. Now, adjusted for inflation, that's about $16,000 to $17,000 in today's money. Even today, that's a lot of money for a bike. Put that in a time of recession, you'll see you can start to see why it didn't sell that well. It's always the accessible ones that sell well. It's the one everyone can ride. It starts up quick. You get up and go. You get on it and go, and it's easy to ride. If you tell someone this is the H2R, get on it and go. I mean, I'll be a little bit intimidated by that, and it was kind of the same thing for the CBX those years. It was a big, heavy, powerful, quick machine. I think you're correct. People were a little scared of it, if you can call it that. It's not that accessible to them.
So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I again want to give a big shout out to Villions Garage, and this was Christoph who we were just talking to. I cut out my parts where I was asking him the questions, partially because they weren't important and also because my camera died in the middle of it and I don't have them. Anyways, he was super helpful and he gave me a lot of really good perspective about the history and about the fact that a recession was looming and just the price of the bike and things like that. It was just really, really interesting and he was really knowledgeable. But yeah, guys, hope you enjoyed. We'll see you guys in the next one. Ride safe.